Despite the superior quality of our fighters, the combat efficiency of the Japanese naval air forces almost immediately fell to less than half that of normal. Those planes capable of making the round-trip missions from Rabaul to attack the American forces were rapidly being depleted, and the remaining aircraft types had become one-way mission planes, which meant an ever more rapid deterioration in our strength. It was not until August 21st, when the Army's Ichiki detachment launched its first offensive to recapture former Japanese airstrips, that our naval air forces in this theatre were able to resume attacks in strength against the enemy. We received badly needed reinforcements of both carrier and land-based warplanes, and prepared to launch a sustained aerial assault against the American forces. But the gods of war decreed otherwise. Although the Buka Air Base on the northern tip of Bougainville Island was made available to our fighters and bombers by August 27th, poor weather seriously handicapped our aerial operations. On numerous occasions, Zero fighters took off in dangerous weather, and, after reaching Guadalcanal Island, were forced by even worse weather conditions to return to their bases without contacting the enemy. During the 23 days from August 21st to September 12th, just prior to the launching of the Army's first general offensive with the Kawaguchi detachment on Guadalcanal, our ground forces received air support on only 10 days. The terrible weather conditions encountered en route broke up 4 major bombing attacks. During the remainder of the time, the weather was so bad that the planes could not even get off the ground. The troops on the front could only curse and fume at the solid sheets of rain and blanketing fog, while our bombers sank deep in mud at the air bases. For the 23-day period during which heavy air support was needed, Zero fighters flew a meagre total of 237 sorties, and our land-based medium attack bombers made only 312 sorties. Under such conditions, we could not prevent the enemy fighters and bombers from attacking our supply lines. Our communications were savagely bombed and machine-gunned. This aerial interdiction proved fatal. We were unable to transport the minimum quantities of ammunition and foodstuffs required by the Army forces on Guadalcanal. The Army's first general offensive against the invading enemy ended in failure. During the Guadalcanal campaign, the numerical superiority of the enemy warplanes was not so great that it could not have been more than equalized by the superior performance of our Zero fighters. As the battle got underway, the American fighter planes opposing us did not match the agility of the Zero in combat. Nevertheless, the enemy air forces enjoyed a tremendous advantage through their ability to rapidly construct and constantly supply new air bases. As of September 24th, following a month of bitter fighting in the theatre, our actual naval air strength was as follows. The normal complement of aircraft consisted of at least 232 Zero fighters and 180 land-based medium attack bombers, the latter group made up equally of Type 96 and Type 1 bombers. Our fighter strength, therefore, was only 34% of the minimum desired, and medium attack bomber strength only 44% of that deemed necessary effectively to combat the enemy. The Guadalcanal situation demanded action, and the Army planned for another general offensive to commence in late October. Repeated attacks were mounted against enemy forces on the island. 480 sorties were flown by Zero fighters, and 307 sorties by medium attack bombers during the period of September 28th to October 25th. The attacks were pressed with determination, but our air forces failed to strike a decisive blow against the enemy. On the night of October 13th, naval support was brought up in the form of our battleships Congo and Haruna. The 2 heavy warships steamed offshore near an enemy airfield and shelled enemy aircraft and installations with great success. Despite this, our Army's second general offensive, which began the night of October 24th, was crushed by the savage fighting of the enemy defenders. 2 days later, our carrier forces inflicted telling damage on the enemy in the Battle of Santa Cruz. Despite the losses which the enemy sustained, his position remained strong, and recapture of the dreadful Guadalcanal Island appeared more difficult than ever. Our air forces in the Rabaul area were steadily reinforced with new fighters and bombers from Japan, but many of the aircraft we threw into the battle were lost, and therefore represented only a wasted effort. By October 28th, after a month-long struggle with an enemy which fought fiercely, the 6th Air Corps in the theatre could muster a total of only 30 Zero fighters and 66 land-based medium attack bombers. Our airmen fought desperately, but were unable to stem the tidal wave of enemy power. From the beginning of the operation to recapture Guadalcanal, launched by the Ichiki detachment on August 21st, until the termination of the Army's unsuccessful Second General Offensive, air battle casualties for both sides were as follows: seaplane combat not reported. 340 enemy aircraft were destroyed, and 69 aircraft probably destroyed, for a total of 409. Our naval air forces had lost 78 Zero fighters, 42 land-based medium attack bombers, and 54 other types, all either destroyed or missing. Before the Third General Offensive, designed to throw the American forces at Guadalcanal, was launched, the air war had taken a downward course from which there seemed to be little hope of salvation. We were unable to supply the land-based naval air forces in the theatre with sufficient aircraft to maintain more than an average strength of 160 planes in combat at any one time. Although we resorted to desperate measures to build up overwhelming air strength, they were of slight avail. There is little question that, had our air combat forces received adequate support through construction of new air bases and the proper maintenance of existing facilities, we could have destroyed many more enemy planes and ships, and might have influenced the ground fighting in our favour. However, the situation deteriorated steadily as Japanese construction crews seemingly delayed their efforts to build new air bases. As late as September 6, 1942, the Navy had managed to construct only one new airbase, and that was a single installation at Buin on the south end of Bougainville Island, which lies between Rabaul and Guadalcanal. The Army's Third General Offensive, intended to retake Guadalcanal, suffered the same fate as the two previous attempts. 6 months of bitter fighting, during which we had expended many hundreds of planes, warships, the lives of thousands of men, and staggering amounts of material, went for naught. On February 7, 1943, the last troops abandoned Guadalcanal. For our land and surface forces, the period immediately following the evacuation of Guadalcanal came to be a temporary lull in the war. The absence of major action afforded the opportunity for regrouping and strengthening. There was, however, no respite for the naval air arm, which launched large-scale air attacks. The first of a number of heavy air assaults against the enemy was the so-called IGO operation, which was carried out from early to mid-April. The strategic air campaign was under the direct command of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. The land-based air force under the command of Vice Admiral Jinichi Kusaka constituted 190 planes. 160 carrier planes under the command of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa were likewise thrown into the operation. While the 350 aircraft participating in the IGO campaign represented considerably more strength than had been hurled against the enemy at Guadalcanal, the total number of aircraft was less than that of the Nagumo force, which had smashed Pearl Harbor. Air attacks in strength were directed against Guadalcanal and southeast New Guinea, striking in particular at Port Moresby, Oro Bay, and Milne Bay. 4 heavy raids appeared to have achieved the desired results in destruction of enemy aircraft and ground facilities, but disaster struck even as the new aerial offensive gained in momentum. En route to an inspection trip on the front, flying in a bomber escorted by 9 fighters, on April 18th, Admiral Yamamoto was ambushed over the southwestern tip of Bougainville Island by Lockheed P-38 fighters of the American 13th Air Force, and was killed in the devastating attack. His loss was a severe blow to the Japanese forces. By now it was obvious to all our military leaders that the outcome of any conflict, whether waged on the sea, on land, or in the air, depended upon the ability of our fighters to establish control of the air. Accordingly, requests for air support made by sea and land commanders invariably were for fighter planes, which could guard the sea and land forces against enemy destruction from the air. The concept of important air battles may be simplified by imagining the clashing of great air fleets, the core of which is constituted of fighter planes. The fighter planes opposing the enemy should be superior in performance and range. Every effort should also be made to ensure numerical superiority, for the difference even of a single fighter can decide the outcome of a major conflict. By the time the IGO operation had been launched, it was obvious that the 4 pre-war predictions concerning a struggle with the United States and Great Britain were to be realized. The insistence of numerous Japanese military and industrial leaders that a war against the United States and Great Britain might well become a prolonged battle with little prospect of victory for a nation of such limited resources as Japan was now assuming ominous reality. In the Guadalcanal campaign, the inability of our Navy to replace the Zero fighters lost in combat with the enemy became clear, and this crack in our air power wall spread ever wider as the war progressed. Replacement of Zero fighters on every front was becoming more and more difficult, and never achieved the numbers requested by combat leaders. Japan lacked other fighters in sufficient numbers to replace the Zero, and our air strength was steadily whittled down, even as enemy power gained monstrous proportions. The average monthly output of Zero fighters from April of 1942 through June of 1943 totaled 221 aircraft, even with the combined production facilities of Mitsubishi and Nakajima. A severe handicap of the Guadalcanal campaign was the inability of the Army properly to integrate its air strength into combined operations with naval air units. The Navy should have received support at least to the extent that half of all missions were carried out by Army air power. Unfortunately, this ratio was never attained, partly due to the fact that the majority of operations were conducted over a vast expanse of ocean. Consequently, the Navy's Zero fighters, which were designed for carrier use and originally assigned to fleet divisions, were forced to fight in inferior numbers against all types of fighters and bombers, which were divided into categories consisting of carrier and land-based craft. Float-type reconnaissance planes and zero-observation seaplanes were forced to undertake what were virtually suicide missions. Superhuman efforts were demanded of our pilots because of the insufficient number of Zero fighters. The qualitative superiority of our Navy planes could no longer compensate for the lack of numbers. In June of 1943, the Allied powers resumed their offensives from both the Solomon Islands and New Guinea fronts. The Navy poured hundreds of Zero fighters and Type 1 land-based attack bombers into this decisive theatre in an attempt to destroy the effectiveness of the enemy's air power. But the battle of land-based air forces resulted only in imposing an increasing burden upon our Navy. Our position worsened steadily as American air strength inexorably gained the coveted position for which it struggled so relentlessly. How many of our far-sighted planners and military leaders then arose openly to regret that the air arms of our Navy and Army were not welded into a single coordinated force resembling that of the Americans? This desire for coordinated air control was no mere wish to ease our command structure. The inability of Japanese forces effectively to utilize air power lost us the Gilbert Islands. This bastion fell to enemy hands in late November of 1943, and for precisely the same reason, lack of naval air strength, we lost the key points of the Marshall Islands in February of 1944. This loss seriously threatened our combat potential in the entire Pacific. The effectiveness of the enemy's incessant air blows raised a losing battle to the status of a tragedy. To prevent an almost complete loss of our forces in the Rabaul area, Admiral Minichi Koga, the new commander of the combined fleet, reluctantly ordered all naval air units to abandon Rabaul, the only major airbase in the southwest Pacific opposing the advancing enemy. On February 20th, 1944, our unit, Masatake Okumiya, evacuated the island as the last air unit of the withdrawal, leaving behind only our ground forces. These successive withdrawals from our air bases could be regarded as nothing less than major disasters. Every base which was abandoned meant another enemy advance toward the heart of Japan, and another key point from which the enemy could dispatch his far-ranging bombers. Each airbase lost involved not only ground installations taken over by the Americans, but a never-to-be-regained loss in our ability further to resist the enemy. Furthermore, those ordering the hasty withdrawals from advanced airbases often overlooked and abandoned the numerous maintenance crews. Men whose skills represented the experience of many years were deserted, despite desperate rescue operations undertaken by plane and submarine in remote jungle facilities. Thus, we lost forever their ability to contribute to subsequent air operations. This loss became increasingly evident as the enemy's pressure mounted. The absence of these invaluable mechanics and maintenance crews greatly affected our operations. Maintenance suffered disastrously, and mechanics rushed through hasty training programs proved woefully inadequate for their tasks. Our already enormous difficulties were increased by the fact that mechanics with little experience were forced to work on aircraft which had been rushed through expanded production lines. On too many occasions, pilots and aircrew members fell prey to enemy guns because vital plane parts failed in the crucial moments of combat. We were faced with a vicious circle of attrition for which there appeared to be no solution. The shortage of new fighter planes meant that we must often send our best pilots into combat with worn and damaged planes. Their chances of survival against an enemy whose strength was growing daily were thereby greatly lessened. As enemy attacks and our own deficiencies placed a steady drain on our fighting strength, the Americans were free to strike and fight at their discretion. Although the Navy still possessed the two monster battleships Yamato and Musashi, each of nearly 74,000 tons gross weight, and each mounting 9 18-inch guns, we were forced carefully to husband our strength for only the most critical battles. The hunters had become the hunted. The Guadalcanal Campaign, evaluation of American warplanes. The first formidable opponent which the Zero fighter encountered was the four-engined Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Before the war, 35 of the heavy bombers were reportedly deployed on Luzon Island, but the majority of these planes were destroyed on the ground before the war was yet a full day old. Those few B-17s which managed to take to the air were attacked by Zero fighters in such numbers that they were overwhelmed and shot down before our overeager pilots could study their characteristics. During the period between these initial attacks and the successful completion of the Dutch East Indies campaign in March of 1942, the B-17s increasingly interrupted our operations with unexpected bombing raids. Their great radius of at least 750 nautical miles enabled them to fly from bases far beyond the reach of our Type 96 and Type 1 land-based bombers, upon which the Navy had placed such high hopes. Thanks to the excellent protection afforded by their bristling 12.7 mm machine guns, self-sealing fuel tanks, great load capacity, and far-reaching range, the B-17s continued to harass our forces in courageous and tenacious attacks. Our commanders believed the B-17 to be the enemy's only hope in the almost helpless plight in which he found himself in the early part of the war. Immediately after our occupation of Rabaul in late January of 1942, B-17s based at Port Moresby launched a series of persistent day and night attacks which rained bombs on our installations. Zero fighters of the Tainan Air Corps, a veteran fighter unit which had fought constantly against enemy planes since the outbreak of war, swarmed up to intercept and destroy the big bombers. It was not long before the Zero fighter pilots realized that they were confronted with an enemy plane well capable of defending itself, and one which could survive tremendous damage from the guns and cannon of the Zeros. On numerous occasions, the Boeings flew undaunted on their bombing and reconnaissance missions, despite the attacks of Zero fighters which swarmed about them, and which the enemy's heavy machine guns too often destroyed. Flying Fortresses on reconnaissance discovered the Japanese invasion convoy bound for Port Moresby in May of 1942. This led directly to the savagely fought Coral Sea Battle. Without the B-17's tremendous range, many of our operations would have been successfully executed without encountering enemy interference. The Midway Sea Battle of June 1942 was also due to far-reaching B-17s, which scoured the ocean surface in search of our invasion fleet and radioed the position of our ships to powerful American bombing forces. In the Guadalcanal campaign, the movement of our forces was constantly exposed to the prying eyes of B-17 crewmen. We came to learn that it was almost impossible to conceal our activities within 700 nautical miles of any base which might harbour flying fortresses, and within 800 nautical miles of bases from which consolidated Vultee B-24 Liberator bombers might take off. The B-17s and B-24s seemed almost to ignore the intercepting Zeros as they flew into any area of their choice. Sun, the great Chinese strategist, once wisely said, "Those who know the enemy as well as they know themselves never suffer defeat." This historical statement was never proved truer than by the probing missions of the B-17 and B-24 bombers, which endowed the Americans with a tremendous advantage in the far-flung Pacific War. For years, the Japanese Navy had followed a strategic concept laid down by tradition, that a small Japanese force could achieve victory over superior enemy strength only so long as we were informed of the enemy's strength and movement, while ours remained hidden. With the B-17s and B-24s thundering constantly over our ships, airfields, and staging areas, the situation was reversed. We were in the position of the traditional enemy and handicapped by the same limitations we had always regarded as the opponent's weakness. Placed in the uncomfortable position of having our every movement fully known to the enemy, we were compelled to discard plans long prepared and resort to the application of mass strength and force in battle. The strength of quantity could well outweigh the value of quality in a modern war in which new pawns could be hurled into the theatre of decision as rapidly and as long as the accumulated reserves would permit, especially in sea and air conflicts where the machine, not man, played such a decisive role. Mechanical strength in overwhelming quantity also had a direct bearing on the fighting ability of ground troops, whose fate in the Pacific War depended solely upon marine transportation and supply. By September of 1942, the reconnaissance mission flying B-17s and B-24s had become a grave problem, and the Japanese Navy tried every possible means of destroying the troublesome raiders. With the Guadalcanal campaign in full swing, our fighter pilots became desperate, but failed to achieve any notable advance in increasing the number of destroyed American bombers. Only overwhelming numbers of Zero fighters could destroy the enemy marauders, and there was little hope that we might acquire fighter planes with heavier firepower than that of the Zero. Although the B-24 lacked the protection of the B-17 in total number of defending guns and other characteristics, the two airplanes were unique in their ability to defeat enemy fighter attacks. Neither Britain, Germany, nor Japan produced bombers capable of protecting themselves, as well as the fortresses and liberators. We believed that the heavy American bombers, with their great defensive power and amazing aggressiveness in battle, stemming from a great national strength and a national policy which at all times proved itself to be aggressive, were fundamentally responsible for the defeat of Germany and Japan. Before we could unearth a satisfactory solution to the problems presented by the flying fortresses and liberators, we faced another dilemma with equally severe consequences. This was posed by the Army's twin-engined Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighter planes. Although the American Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk and Bell P-39 Airacobra fighters featured high diving speeds, and the Navy's Grumman F-4F Wildcat exhibited good maneuverability, their general performance failed to measure up to that of the Zero. Like these fighters, the P-38s first used in combat against the Zeros appeared to lack any distinctive features other than speed at great altitude and a very high diving speed. The strange Lightnings made their combat debut in the Solomon Islands during the fall of 1942. Soon they were appearing in ever-increasing numbers, often challenging our Zero fighters. To the great delight of our pilots, the P-38 pilots would attempt to dogfight with the Zeros, which managed to shoot down many of the enemy planes. It was obvious, from contrast with later combat, that the Americans had not as yet learned the most favourable characteristics of the big, heavy P-38, and that the airplane was at first more misused in combat than properly flown. Before long, however, the painful lesson of burning P-385 changed the situation. The Americans soon adopted new tactics which made the most of the P-38's superior performance at high altitude. Once the enemy pilots became aware of the Zero's poor high-altitude performance and its inability to dive at great speed, we were faced with an enemy of terrifying effectiveness. It was no longer possible for the Zero fighters to successfully engage the P-38s, except under the most unusual conditions, which, unhappily, seldom presented themselves. The P-38s would patrol at extreme height above the altitude at which the Zeros could fly. Their great speed at high altitude enabled them to maneuver into the most advantageous positions. Then the big fighters would plunge from the sky to smash into the hapless Zero fighters. The peculiar sound of the P-38's twin engines became both familiar and bitterly hated by the Japanese all across the South Pacific. Our ground crews, especially those servicing the Zero fighters, could only shake their fists in futile gestures as the P-38s with their high-pitched roar flew dauntlessly over Buin on Bougainville Island, Rabaul, and other South Pacific bases. Pilots, too, were often heard cursing the speedy P-38s, which flaunted their flashing performance. The P-38 pilot was in a most enviable position. He could choose to fight when and where he desired, and on his own terms. Under such conditions, the Lightning became one of the most deadly of all enemy planes. If the P-38s appeared to challenge our fighters, the Zeros were forced to wait until the P-38s attacked under conditions most favourable to themselves. A Japanese victory was possible only when the enemy fighters made a positive bid to engage in a dogfight. Since the P-38s could choose the exact place and moment of combat, however, such opportunities were exceedingly rare. There is in this lesson of P-38 versus Zero the fundamental difference between air battles and those conflicts which occur on the land or sea surface. The only possible means of commencing major air combat at a desired moment is through the possession of aircraft superior to those available to the enemy. To enhance the possibility of success in air conflict, the maximum possible number of aircraft should be committed to battle. Since the Japanese naval air arm had made long and assiduous preparations toward achieving qualitative and numerical superiority long before the outbreak of war, it was possible to satisfy these two prerequisites in the early fighting. Before long, however, the enemy was rapidly whittling down the quantitative superiority, and, 1 year after the war had begun, the qualitative superiority was hanging by a thread and was fast disappearing. With our victorious sweep in the Pacific marred only by the single minor incident of Wake Island, our naval air forces began to suffer even more than usual the difficulties of an air war which began to favour the enemy. The first single-engine American fighter to seriously challenge the Zero was the Chance-Vought F-4U Corsair. At first, this fighter was reported to our naval intelligence as a carrier-borne plane which had failed in its carrier qualification tests because of poor deck-landing characteristics. The main American counter-offensives, which were launched from Guadalcanal, however, favoured the use of the new fighter because of the availability of land bases. In a short period of time, the excellent qualities of the Corsair became only too evident, and the enemy rapidly increased the Corsair fighter strength in the Solomons campaign. The strongest increase was noted about February of 1943, when we withdrew from Guadalcanal Island. Faster than the Zero in level flight and capable of infinitely greater diving speeds, the Corsairs soon proved to be a great nuisance to our fighters. So long as the number of Corsairs in any particular dogfighting engagement was not too great, the Zero fighters managed to cope with the enemy planes. As the total number of Corsairs increased, however, the outnumbered Zeros ran into serious trouble, and the Japanese fighter commands were soon faced with serious losses inflicted by the speedy American Navy fighters. The Corsair was the first single-engine fighter, which clearly surpassed the Zero in performance. During the Gilbert's campaign in September of 1943, the enemy's new Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter made its debut. The carrier-borne fighter plane was to become one of the Zero's most formidable opponents. Our first reports on the new Grumman fighter stated that its design had been affected by a careful American examination of a Zero fighter captured in the Aleutians in the spring of 1942. To some extent, this appeared to be so, since the philosophy of weight saving was carried throughout the Hellcat's structure, to an extent without parallel in other American aircraft of that time. There is no doubt that the new Hellcat was superior in every respect to the Zero, except in the factors of maneuverability and range. It carried heavier armament, could outclimb and outside the Zero, could fly at higher altitudes, and was well protected with self-sealing fuel tanks and armor plate. Like the Wildcat and Corsair, the new Grumman was armed with 6 12.7mm machine guns, but it carried a much greater load of ammunition than the other fighters. Of the many American fighter planes we encountered in the Pacific, the Hellcat was the only aircraft which could acquit itself with distinction in a fighter-versus-fighter dogfight. The Americans claimed that with the Hellcat, the United States Navy had recovered for the first time since the war's beginning the ability to engage the Japanese Zero in close-in fighting. The favorite American maneuver was to assign a pair of fighters to attack a Zero fighter in a steep dive, during which high speed was attained. Once the Zero was within range of the enemy guns, the Hellcats would open fire, roar past, and make a sharp turn to withdraw. Of the many American fighters, the Hellcat was the only plane the design of which was undertaken after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and then placed in mass production for Pacific use. More than 10,000 F-6F fighters were built before production ceased at the end of 1945. Like the Corsair, the Hellcat was equipped with a Pratt & Whitney 2,000 horsepower, air-cooled double Wasp radial engine. The more powerful the engine in a fighter plane, the better its performance will be. This is especially true of fighters in which climbing ability is stressed. With increased engine power, a fighter plane may also increase its armament, be fitted with self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plate and other equipment, and not unduly sacrifice performance. Japanese engineers had too long delayed their efforts toward producing practicable, powerful aircraft engines, and a wide gap existed between the superior products of the United States and the engines we could produce. Despite our strenuous efforts, we could not hope to match the superb products of American technology. In 1944, Mitsubishi rushed mass production of its 2,000 horsepower class Shei-42 engine, but the engine's weight prohibited its successful use on fighter planes. Lieutenant Commander Mitsugu Kofukuda, flight commander of the 6th Air Corps assigned to the Buin Air Base, participated in the Guadalcanal battle during the 7 months following the American invasion. Commander Kofukuda later edited copious notes he had kept through the campaign. These afford unusual insight into air activities and combat of that period. Throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, a variety of American Army and Navy aircraft participated in combat against Japanese forces. The majority of fighter planes encountered during the invasion were Navy Grumman F-4F Wildcats and Army Curtiss P-40 Tomahawks, but the F-4F fighters increased greatly in number after the battle had begun. Bell P-39. Airacobras were observed in fair numbers when the campaign began, but these were gradually replaced with the big Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighters. Chance Vought F-4U Corsairs participated in the Guadalcanal, fighting only toward the end of the campaign. The Stubby Grumman Wildcats featured performance characteristics generally similar to those of our Zero fighters, but the enemy plane proved inferior in almost every respect to the Zero. Because of the general similarity, however, dogfights between the Wildcats and Zeros were not uncommon. In these combats, the Japanese pilots possessed a decided advantage, since the Zero could outmaneuver its opponent and was able to outclimb, and could fly faster than the Grummans. The initial and one-sided victories which the Zero fighters scored in the early phase of the war endowed the plane with mysterious characteristics. mysterious only to the American pilots, of course. The Zero's flashing maneuverability and speed, which had resulted in the destruction of hundreds of enemy planes, seemed to convince the American pilots that the Zero could not be defeated in a close-in battle in which the opponents were of equal number. In fact, our pilots reported that when an enemy fighter plane force sighted a Zero formation of equal strength, it usually would refuse to join combat and would flee. This observation was made chiefly in the Solomons area, although, of course, such enemy timidity was not always to be relied upon. On many occasions, courageous enemy pilots would not only dive in to attack our formations when they were of equal strength, but would not hesitate to assault our fighter and bomber formations, even when heavily outnumbered. However, there was no denying the fact that our pilots enjoyed absolute confidence in their ability to always emerge victorious from an air battle in which enemy and friendly forces were of equal number. Such confidence was not limited to the pilots. It was shared by the Air Force Headquarters staff. When our Zero pilots were forced into an engagement in which their strength was about half that of the enemy, the usual outcome was a wild melee which usually resulted in equal damage to both opponents. As the maneuverability of the Army P-38 and P-40 fighter was markedly inferior to that of the Zero, the enemy pilots soon learned to avoid dogfights, in which they were at a decided disadvantage. While the P-40 possessed approximately the same maximum speed as the Zero, it lacked the rate of climb of our fighter and could not hope to match the Zero in close combat. The P-40 pilots therefore took advantage of their superior diving speed and almost always resorted to shoot and retreat tactics. Thus, the P-40s usually refused combat unless they possessed the advantage of altitude, which enabled them to dive into the Zero formations with blazing guns and race away at a diving speed beyond that possible for the Zero. Soon after their introduction to combat, the big, heavy P-38 fighters learned to take advantage of their excellent high-altitude speed and performance and of their superior diving speed. They adopted the tactics of diving from high altitude, slashing into the Zero formations with their heavy machine guns and cannon, and zooming upwards in a climb no Zero could hope to match. Taking every advantage of their superior high-altitude performance and high speed, they were rarely caught in a position in which they could be forced to engage in close-in fighting. It appeared to be a rule of the P-38 pilots not to fight with a Zero fighter at less than 300 miles per hour, at which point the Zero suffered from sluggish aileron action. On some occasions, P-38 formations would descend from their usual great altitude in high-speed formation dives. The initial attacking wave scattered the Zeros. Other formations would follow from their vantage points to rip through the disorganized Zero fighters, inflicting unexpectedly heavy losses. Single-engined bombers encountered in the Guadalcanal campaign were the Navy's two-seat Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers and the three-seat Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. Twin-engined bombers included the Army's North American B-25 Mitchells and Martin B-26 Marauders. The Zeros sometimes caught Navy Consolidated Vultee PBY Catalina flying boats. Although this is no reflection on their respective combat capabilities as bombers, none of these aircraft proved difficult opponents for the Zero fighter. The four-engined B-17 and B-24 bombers were, generally speaking, the most difficult enemy aircraft for the Zeros to shoot down. Because of their excellent self-sealing fuel tanks, they were extremely difficult to set afire with the Zero's 20mm cannon shells. Our fighter pilots soon learned that the B-17s and B-24s could rarely be destroyed unless the pilots or vital parts of the aircraft were hit and rendered useless. The fierce resistance with which the heavy American bombers opposed our fighters, unlike that of our own land-based medium attack bombers, which too often fell easy prey to enemy fighters, was a most serious problem. In my opinion, which is shared by many Japanese combat officers, the ability of the B-17 and B-24 to defend themselves and carry out their intended missions despite enemy fighter opposition was the deciding factor in the final outcome of the war. A considerable number of these bombers fell prey to our Zero fighters, but their destruction was accomplished only after persistent and merciless attacks, usually at high cost to our own fighters. A survey of our air combat operations against these bombers indicates clearly that they were rarely destroyed by the conventional attack of only a few fighters. As the war progressed, the ability of these bombers to defend themselves became almost unbelievable. Their defensive firepower, speed, operational ceiling, and ability to absorb the punishment of our fighters constantly astonished Japanese pilots. By the time the Boeing B-29 Superfortress appeared on the combat front, we had achieved great strides in increasing the firepower of our fighters and interceptors. However, even these steps came too late, for the B-29 represented a remarkable advance over the tough B-17, and we were unable to keep pace with American engineering developments. Another factor soon entered into the capacity of the enemy's heavy bombers to flout our air defences. When the B-29s finally appeared in large numbers over the Japanese homeland, the quality of our fighter pilots had deteriorated disastrously. New pilots were unable effectively to press home their attacks on the enemy bombers, which soon began to run rampant over our cities. Had Japan developed such bombers as the B-17, I believe the war would have taken a different course. We did not have a single warplane comparable to these aircraft, and Japanese forces paid a heavy price for this lack. As was demonstrated by the qualities of the Zero fighter and the Type 1 land-based medium attack bomber, our aeronautical engineering standards had been raised to a high level. No one can deny, however, that our engineers and airmen, when comparing our bombers to those of the enemy, keenly felt the difference, the great difference, in the national strength of America and Japan. In all fairness to our aeronautical industry, there was a marked difference in the strategic concepts evolved by Japan and the United States, with a wide gap between the two nations' emphasis on the self-protection of large aircraft. But it is equally true that this difference stemmed from the Americans' scientific ability to keep their aircraft flying despite enemy damage. Developing this characteristic to its ultimate in World War II, they were able to send their unescorted bombers on missions deep within Japanese territory, secure in the knowledge that, despite our best efforts, they stood an excellent chance of returning to their home bases. Author's note: Japan had suffered serious losses in combat with the Type 1 land-based medium attack bomber, the G4M1, which was wryly nicknamed the Type 1 lighter by its crews because of its highly inflammable qualities. When the bomber was revised into the G4M2 modification, the company designers and Navy engineers concentrated their efforts toward increasing the plane's flight range and completely neglected any attempt to improve the bomber's ability to survive enemy firepower. It is no exaggeration to say that this action constituted one of our Navy's greatest technical blunders in the war, a mistake which was comparable to our strategic errors in the disastrous Midway and Guadalcanal operations, in that the continued high loss of the Type 1 bombers to enemy guns seriously affected the final outcome of the war. Tactics of enemy aircraft. During the Guadalcanal campaign, the enemy held to a policy of not committing his air forces to battle before attaining a local superiority of strength. These tactics appeared to hold true whether land, sea, or air forces were involved. In the air battles between opposing fighter-plane formations, the enemy invariably refused to join, in combat unless he enjoyed numerical superiority. When confronted with a superior number of Zero fighters, he refused to engage, lest he sustain unnecessary losses. As a result, our fighter pilots were forced to take great risks when committed to battle, while the enemy based his fighter tactics upon conditions most favourable to his success. This peculiar situation resulted from the fact that, when the enemy chose to fight, he invariably did so when we were outnumbered. The enemy pilots left our men little opportunity to evade combat, for when they did engage the Zeros, the outnumbered Japanese pilots were forced to fight desperately to survive against the numerous American fighter planes. Another marked difference in the tactics of both opponents was to be found in the aerial weapons with which their respective fighter planes were armed. The United States mounted the heavy 12.7mm machine gun with a high rate of fire in almost all their warplanes, while the Zero carried 2 light machine guns plus 2 20mm cannon. The wing cannon had a relatively low firing rate, but were designed to destroy an enemy aircraft with 1 or more hits. This weapon was indispensable to the Zero, which had been designed from the outset to contend with both enemy fighters and bombers. Base construction capacity. A world of difference existed between the ability of the Japanese and Americans to construct air bases in the combat theatres. Basically, we relied upon primitive manpower to clear jungles and pound out airstrips for our planes, while the Americans literally descended in a mass mechanical invasion on jungle, coral and rock to carve out their airbase facilities. This difference in method undeniably and seriously affected the air operations of both belligerents, much to the benefit of the Americans. The construction of adequate airbase installations facilitated rapid and large-scale movement of the enemy's air forces, thus contributing directly to a great increase in his combat strength in any theatre of action. Moreover, the vast and numerous bases gave the enemy the capacity to maintain large groups of interceptors in the air, and deny Japanese bombers the opportunity to destroy enemy planes on the ground. It was obvious that the ability of American engineers to establish air bases wherever and whenever they chose, while Japan struggled against the limitations of primitive methods and a lack of material and engineering construction skill, must affect the final outcome of the war to no minor degree in favour of the United States. One of the major points which has too often been overlooked in an evaluation of fighting power, but which determined to a large extent the efficiency of air units, was that of hygienic installations. Japanese engineers paid scant attention to this problem, dismissing the pressing matter of mosquito protection by simply rigging mosquito nets in personnel quarters. Sanitary facilities were basically crude and ineffective. Certainly they contributed nothing to the morale of ground and air crews. The Americans, by contrast, swept vast areas surrounding their ground installations with advanced mechanical aids. Through exhaustive disinfecting operations, they banished flies and mosquitoes from their air bases and paid similar attention to every phase of sanitation and disease. Some may consider this a prosaic matter, but it was vital to the men forced to live on desert islands and in the midst of jungles swarming with disease and insect life. The inevitable outcome of such neglect was a tremendous difference in the health of the American and Japanese personnel who were assigned to these forward air facilities. In such matters as the support of our combat weapons, the Japanese Army and Navy proved to be woefully neglectful. It was a classic blunder for which we paid dearly. Disease and insect plagues can hinder air operations as effectively as enemy attack. The Navy, of course, made some attempts to organize mosquito prevention and disease prevention units, but only on a small and insignificant scale. Even the efforts to expedite the construction of forward air bases with mechanical devices achieved little success. It was impossible to accumulate in only a few months the knowledge and experience which the Americans had gathered over many years. To our distress, it became evident that our military and government leaders had never really understood the meaning of total war. Japan lacked the knowledge and the means with which to integrate its national resources into the most effective war machine. While these officials often spoke of total war, today it is clear that their knowledge of such matters was sorely limited, and that their enthusiasm was confined largely to vocal efforts. Our defeat at Guadalcanal was due primarily to the great military strength and the tenacious attacks of the enemy on land, at sea, and in the air, but causes of that defeat were to be found also directly within the combined fleet. The primary failure on our part lay in the utter lack of a fixed policy for the construction of island air bases. Even in the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, when our forces swept aside enemy resistance in the opening attacks of the war, we established a policy of constructing air bases so that no more than 300 nautical miles would separate these installations. Even when our planes were required to fly over open water, our airbase distances did not exceed 380 nautical miles, as between Kendari and Kupang. At Guadalcanal, however, the Navy bungled its planning for logistics support, and no explanation can possibly excuse the failure to provide air bases in the approximately 600 nautical mile stretch between Rabaul and Guadalcanal. This was perhaps the most serious error committed by our Navy in the Southwest Pacific, and stemmed directly from the unjustified optimism created by our initial victories. This overconfidence, in retrospect an attitude which is seen to have engendered fatal consequences, prevented our commanding officers from evaluating soberly the inevitable enemy counterattack. It is also true that this episode illustrates the Japanese Navy's true nature, for we repeatedly failed to investigate our future needs for mutual assistance between military bases, the transportation and logistics requirements of our forces, and the anticipated distances between our air installations and those of the enemy. Our second fault lay in the fact that we never studied properly the problems of airbase construction, maintenance and supply. Neither did we appreciate accurately the limitations of air operations which could be conducted from any land installation. Despite our overwhelming initial successes, we literally ignored the priceless advantages afforded us in respect to the time in which we had to enlarge existing bases, to construct new facilities, and to determine to the last pound the supply requirements for our bases. Thus, while we could have prepared a bastion of air power networks from which our planes could have effectively assaulted the Guadalcanal invaders, we did nothing toward this end. This failure on our part in great measure caused the loss of Guadalcanal. It was a bizarre situation, for in such matters as aircraft performance, pilot skill, and efficient use of manpower, we clearly exceeded the enemy's best efforts. Our overconfidence, however, cost us the results of years of painstaking labour and allowed the enemy to begin his long trek back into the Pacific, which resulted eventually in our total defeat. This inability to coordinate the military and economic strength at our disposal was not restricted to the Navy Air Force only. It existed to a much severer degree within the ranks of the Army, and indeed might accurately be described as characteristic of the entire nation. The blame rested directly upon the shoulders of the Naval General Staff of Tokyo and with the staff officers of the combined fleet. They, too, allowed overconfidence to dim their appraisal of the Pacific situation, and, since they were directly responsible for the war's conduct, the guilt is primarily theirs. This lack of competence undermined much of the brilliant work performed by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who suddenly found his formerly advancing forces facing an enemy fighting savagely for an obscure island in the southwest Pacific. All the Admiral's meticulous plans, which had proven so effective in this battle area, foundered suddenly in the face of our own deficiencies. Certainly the interval between the time of our occupation of the Solomons and the enemy's return should have allowed us to hurl a wall of fire and steel at the invading forces. Instead, our planes disappeared in the open sea from lack of fuel. Our pilots became exhausted from overextended missions. We encountered severe difficulties in replacement of men, material, and aircraft, and we watched helplessly as enemy strength inexorably increased. The most bitter pill of all for Admiral Yamamoto to swallow was that, despite our obvious lack of preparation, we still had immediately available in the Guadalcanal area sufficient strength to mount a strong counterattack which could have wrecked the American invasion fleet and caused terrible casualties among the still comparatively weak landing forces. There was every reason to believe, from the available Japanese strength in the area, that we would make this counterattack. Not only did we have effective air power, but our combined fleet could at once muster at least twice the surface strength of the enemy fleet. Instead, while the enemy committed to the defence of his initial precarious beachhead all available aircraft, the new battleships South Dakota and Washington, and all available warships, units of our combined fleet remained uselessly at anchor at Rabaul and Truk. At the precise moment when the enemy's plans hung desperately on coordination of his efforts, and when our fleet was in a most favourable position to disrupt the invasion and destroy the enemy ships, we failed to act. This lack of decision later cost us dearly, for the advantages once presented in the early stages of the Guadalcanal fighting disappeared rapidly, and our own fleet suffered repeated defeats. Many of our own strategists have compared the defeat at Guadalcanal with the havoc suffered at Midway. Truly, our same weaknesses responsible for the great American naval victory in the former battle appear to have been repeated. The successful enemy invasion of Guadalcanal and subsequent enemy campaigns led many of our people to believe that Japan lost the war simply because the Navy overestimated the ability of our army to defend the islands in the Pacific. They felt that this succession of Japanese army defeats at the hands of the rampaging American amphibious forces was directly responsible for the Navy's own losses. We who evaluated realistically the capabilities of our own army knew only too well that our ground forces never were prepared adequately for Pacific combat. For years, our army trained to fight a war with Russia, which it regarded as inevitable. This same army group of leaders woefully lacked a true understanding of the United States. They were not aware of the nature and the strength of the American people, nor did they appreciate the overwhelming military strength American industry could bring to bear against any enemy. I do not believe that our own Naval General Staff was so ill-informed or so unintelligent as to misjudge the Army's strength in times of emergency. It was a poorly held secret among the military hierarchy that our Army was never truly capable of extensive island operations. To us, the Army was a cripple, and at best its effectiveness would always be limited. Ever since the beginning of the second stage operation, prefaced by the disaster at Midway, Admiral Yamamoto faced a situation which became increasingly desperate. One might say frankly that, despite his most intensive future efforts, the Admiral was doomed to know only defeat for the remainder of the war. With the enemy finally in firm possession of Guadalcanal Island, we were now defending ourselves against future enemy attacks. The Pacific War had run through its first full cycle, and the enemy was on the move. Studying carefully our defense positions across the Pacific, Admiral Yamamoto discovered that our chain of island defenses and fleet units was riddled with weak points through which the enemy could strike. It was vital that these gaps be plugged, that we establish as close to an impregnable defense line as was possible. Yamamoto's greatest need was for time. It was necessary to hold back the mounting enemy blows until we had secured our defences. Abruptly, the Admiral's attention was drawn to the increasing tempo of enemy air attacks in the eastern part of New Guinea and the Solomons. The effectiveness of enemy air strength was brought to the Admiral with the news of a crushing defeat, which, if similar events were permitted to occur in the future, promised terrifying disasters for Japan. On the afternoon of March 2, 1943, a large Japanese convoy was sighted by patrolling B-24 bombers north of Cape Gloucester, bound for Leh in an effort to reinforce our troops in the Leh-Salamaua area. The convoy consisted of 8 destroyers: Shikanami, Yukikaze, Asagamo, Uranami, Arashio, Asashio, Shirayuki, and Tokitsukaze, a special service vessel, Nojima, and 8 transports, the 3,800-ton Shinano Maru, 6,870-ton Teiyo Maru, 6,500-ton Oigawa Maru, 5,500-ton Kyokusei Maru, 3,550-ton Taimei Maru, 2,746-ton Ayo Maru, 700-ton Kenbu Maru, and 543-ton Kokoku Maru. Aboard the convoy, in addition to the crews of the vessels, were 5,000 ground troops assigned to the 51st Division. The Kenbu Maru particularly was sorely needed at Leh, since she carried aircraft, fuel, spare parts, and other vital supplies. When first sighted, the convoy lay protected beneath a solid weather front, broken only occasionally. The B-24 sighting, however, had been dispatched immediately to nearby enemy air combat units. By daybreak of March 3rd, the Americans, aided by Australian units, hurled a savage attack against the convoy. 137 planes of the 5th Air Force and the RAAF battered our ships. Everything from fighters to heavy bombers, including B-17s, B-24s, A-20s, B-25s, P-38s, and Beaufighters, swarmed at the helpless convoy. Other enemy fighters, meanwhile, attacked our airfields to draw off Zero fighters based at Leh and Salamaua. Bombs crashed with deadly accuracy into one ship after the other, and the enemy planes raked the vessels with machine guns and cannon to add to the carnage. Despite frantic defensive action by Zero fighters, we could do almost nothing to stem the vicious attack. By early afternoon, closing weather afforded the convoy a respite as low clouds forced the enemy planes to withdraw. They left behind them a bizarre sea littered with bodies and wreckage. During the night of March 3 to 4, enemy seaplanes tracked the convoy, what was left of it, and dropped bombs intermittently without effect. The breaking dawn confirmed the fears of survivors. The planes came screaming in again, skipping bombs across the water and strafing with uncanny accuracy. By now the convoy lay some 60 miles east of Salamaua, but the weather no longer favoured the ships, and the enemy fighters and bombers ran a shuttle from New Guinea bases to Huon Gulf to maintain the attack. Steadily the convoy dwindled as the ships went down. During the night, enemy torpedo boats raced through the convoy and sent a torpedo crashing into a cargo vessel which had been lying dead in the water. The ship went down at once. On March 5th, as enemy fighters raked the wreckage and survivors in strafing attacks, a bomber brought the disaster to a finale by sinking the only destroyer still in the area. Every transport, as well as the Nojima and 4 destroyers, was sent to the bottom. Only 4 destroyers, the Shikinami, Yukikaze, Asagumo, and Uranami, were able to reach Friendly Harbour. Desperately needed supplies littered the Bismarck Sea, and some 3,000 corpses floated in the oily, bloody waters. The enemy planes shot 10 Zeros out of the sky and badly damaged 5 others. Despite the fact that destroyers and submarines bent every effort to rescue survivors, we saved only 2,734 men. The enemy lost 3 P-38s, 1 B-17, 1 B-25, and 1 Beaufighter. Our losses for this single battle were fantastic. Not during the entire savage fighting at Guadalcanal did we suffer a single comparable blow. It became imperative that we block the continued enemy air activities before these attacks became commonplace. We knew we could no longer run cargo ships or even fast destroyer transports to any front on the north coast of New Guinea, east of Wewak. Our supply operation to northeastern New Guinea became a scrabbler's run of barges, small craft, and submarines. Admiral Yamamoto personally assumed command of his air forces in the theatre, establishing advanced command headquarters at Rabaul. He intended specifically to direct all air activities to destroy enemy air power in the area. This was Operation A, Aigo Sakusen. Yamamoto established 21st Air Flotilla headquarters at Kavieng on the northern end of New Ireland under Rear Admiral Toshinosuke Ichimam, and sent the 26th Air Flotilla to Bai on southern Bougainville under Rear Admiral Kanae Kozaka. The air groups of the 1st Carrier Division, under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, moved into Rabaul. Also placed at Rabaul was the main body of the 21st Air Flotilla under Rear Admiral Ichimaru. The air groups of the 2nd Carrier Division under Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuda remained in Rabaul only when not in action. When attacking Guadalcanal, the division advanced its headquarters to our base on Balale Island, near Buin. Admiral Yamamoto had immediately available a total air strength of 350 planes, including 190 under Vice Admiral Kusaka's command, and 160 carrier-based planes under Vice Admiral Ozawa's command. The latter officer had replaced Vice Admiral Nagumo. Despite the scale of Yamamoto's intended operation, his force of 350 airplanes was numerically smaller than that of the Nagumo force employed in the Pearl Harbor attack, or even the Sukahara force used in the Philippines and Malaya area operations. Yamamoto's air fleet could carry a slightly greater weight of bombs, since he would employ twin-engined attack bombers. Nevertheless, the total air power assembled by the Admiral presented an alarming picture. His forces constituted the main strength of Japan's first-line air power after only 18 months of war, during which time our Navy afforded aircraft construction its first priority. In other words, the Navy Air Force had not expanded. Indeed, we now had less combat airplanes than we did at the war's outset. This fact alone demonstrated dramatically the adverse conditions under which our Navy planes combated the enemy, for in this same time interval the Americans, as well as the English and the Australians, hurled ever-increasing numbers of fighters and bombers at us. Further difficulties arose in our pilot replacement program. Guadalcanal had cut sharply into the ranks of qualified pilots, and our Navy Air Force suffered increasingly from difficulties resulting from pilots with insufficient training. Before the outset of Yamamoto's Operation A, I, Okumiya, was Air Staff Officer to Admiral Kakuda, and was required to train many lieutenants directly out of pilot school. These men had behind them barely 30 days of carrier training, and our veteran air leaders hesitated to send the fledglings into combat against the aggressive and experienced American pilots. Not only did we fear for the safety of these new pilots in combat, but many had great difficulty merely in properly flying their fighters and bombers. More than once this lack of experience cost us our invaluable warplanes, as the unqualified pilots skidded, crashed, and burned on takeoff. Admiral Yamamoto hoped that his personal presence in the Rabaul area would spur his instructors to bring these student pilots to a point where they could fly against the enemy with some chance of survival. On April 7, 1943, the attack began in full force. Our planes in heavy strength raided a concentration of enemy vessels anchored at Guadalcanal. On the 11th, we attacked enemy shipping at Oro Bay and Hervey Bay on the east coast of New Guinea. On the 12th, our planes raided the Port Moresby airfield, and on the 14th we attacked the Milne Bay airfield on southeast New Guinea, as well as enemy ships within the harbour. Pilots' reports of the 4 heavy raids indicated that we had inflicted severe damage on the enemy, and intelligence officers reported to Admiral Yamamoto that we sank 1 cruiser, 2 destroyers, and 25 cargo and transport ships, shot down in air combat 134 planes, and wrecked others in ground attacks, which severely damaged 4 enemy air bases. Again, our pilots overestimated the efficiency of their attacks, for post-war investigations revealed that the Americans, while hit hard, suffered far less damage than we were led to believe. Our losses included at least 49 planes shot down and missing, in addition to those which were damaged. Convinced by his pilot's reports that his original goal of wreaking great havoc among the American airfields and reducing the effectiveness of enemy air power had been accomplished, Yamamoto declared Operation A as concluded successfully and ordered his land-based air forces to resume their original attack missions. He sent the carrier-based planes back to Truk, where they rejoined their original groups. I had participated actively in the entire operation, and remember clearly the final conference on the campaign. Our officers expressed great concern over the severe bomber losses we had experienced at the hands of the enemy fighter pilots, for only 4 missions had cost us 50 planes. No other action could have demonstrated so effectively the fact that the Americans were now matching and exceeding the performance of our own aircraft. The meeting concluded in a pessimistic air. We could anticipate only expanding enemy air strength and an ever-increasing drain of our own air power. The demands of Operation A disorganized the 1st Carrier Division's air groups, which was ordered to return to Japan for reorganization, new aircraft, and extended training. To compensate for the loss of the 1st Carrier Division's planes, Admiral Kakuda regretfully split into 2 units his own 2nd Carrier Force, assigning half his strength to Truk and the remainder to the Marshall Islands. As Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleets, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto held the unreserved respect and admiration of every man who served under him. Neither the debacle at Midway nor the shock of the Guadalcanal defeat marred the confidence of his men in the Admiral. This was not merely the result of military conduct, but Yamamoto was afforded a personal loyalty which bordered on the fanatic. No other officer ever approached the immense popularity of this single man, who, when confronted with the unexpected disasters in the Pacific, personally accepted the responsibility for failure, and at no time tolerated accusations of his subordinates. Yamamoto was every inch the perfect military figure, and conducted himself on all occasions with military reserve and aplomb. Even at Rabaul and Truk, he suffered the intense heat of the tropical sun, impeccably attired in the pure white Navy officer uniform. This figure of the Commander-in-Chief, oblivious to heat, tropical humidity, and insects, never failed to impress every officer and enlisted man. Yamamoto was not merely an admiral, he was the personification of the Navy. The Admiral's Operation A was to be launched with a heavy air blow against the enemy on April 7th. On the afternoon of the 6th, Vice Admiral Kakuda planned to leave Vunakanau for our air base at Balale, a small island south of Buin. The Admiral would fly in a Type 1 Betty bomber, which would lead a fighter plane group to join the X-Raid, the first step of the operation. The weather on the 6th was very bad. Constant heavy rains covered the airfield with volcanic ash, and there seemed little prospect for brighter skies. The ground crews worked ceaselessly to maintain our airplanes in readiness, despite the airfield's condition. The roads leading from the field to Rabaul became muddy quagmires, and travel by automobile was a risky affair. Despite the weather and the risk of becoming caught in the mud, Admiral Yamamoto drove to the field personally to see Admiral Kakuda off. The 17-mile trip to the field from Rabaul was a jolting, mud-splattered journey, yet Yamamoto appeared no more uncomfortable than if he were in his Tokyo headquarters. The Commander-in-Chief spoke briefly to the assembled pilots and crew members, wishing them good fortune in the forthcoming battles. To the Japanese pilots, this was a great moment. They were fortified by Yamamoto's good wishes, and no obstacle seemed too great to be overcome. I was in Admiral Kakuda's bomber, the first airplane to leave the mud of the Rabaul field. Behind us, the fighters jockeyed for takeoff position, rocking the landing wheels to clear them from the sucking mire. One by one, the fighters struggled along the strip and lifted into the murky skies. I looked back at the dwindling field, where the white uniforms of Admiral Yamamoto and Vice Admiral Ugaki stood out distinctly against the drab ground. It was an incongruous scene, for Yamamoto looked little different in these forsaken surroundings than when I had last seen him as we left Hiroshima Bay. We assembled our fighters and, with formations complete, set a course south of Rabaul. A massive cloud front filled the entire sky before us, and the black, boiling squall blocked our course. In our bomber, we had little to fear from the weather, but 45 single-seat fighter planes clung grimly to our tail, knowing that losing our guiding plane in the storm ahead meant almost certain death. Despite our anxiety to reach the main battle force at Balal, the storm's severity forced a disappointed Admiral Kakuda to return to Rabaul. We had searched in vain for 20 minutes for a break in the clouds. Our battle plan called for the planes to arrive at Balale at sunset, so that American reconnaissance planes photographing the area would not see the new force of 45 fighters. By the time we returned to Vunakanau 1 hour later, dusk had settled. We sent the fighter planes in to land first. 43 Zeros made their precarious landings in the mud without damage, but 2 planes sank into the treacherous surface and damaged their propellers and undercarriage. Finally, in the dark, our own bomber landed. I was astonished to see Admiral Yamamoto waiting for our plane. Informed of our radio message that we were returning to base, he remained to see Admiral Kakuda. The initial mass attack against the enemy could not be postponed after the 6th, for our forces had long prepared for the raids and were in the most advantageous position to strike. Our 45 fighter planes were desperately needed to escort the bombers against the expected heavy opposition. While it was imperative that we get to Balal, further flight tonight was impossible. After our plane landed, I proceeded at once along the muddy, darkened road from the field to Admiral Ozawa's headquarters to receive new orders. We conferred at length on the attack requirements, and not until many hours later did I leave the Admiral's headquarters with an order that our planes were to leave Balal early in the morning of the 7th. We would fly directly to our rendezvous and participate in the air blows. Even as I returned to the field, I met a car dispatched for me by an anxious and worried Admiral Kakuda. The sudden change in plans involved hasty last-minute briefings of the pilots, for we were to leave from the Vunakanau airfield and join the attack directly. Our flight time would be increased, and the pilots were unfamiliar with the areas over which they would pass. Our pilots were, however, confident that they would completely fulfill Admiral Yamamoto's expectations for the success of the attack. We carried out Raid X as scheduled. Following the completion of Operation A, which Admiral Yamamoto was led to believe had caused great damage to the enemy, the Admiral prepared to make a personal survey of our forward bases. He conferred with the commanders and officers of the various air corps, stressing that the future of the war could not permit complacency. The Admiral stated further that many great sea battles were yet to be fought, and that victory or defeat in those same battles, and consequently the outcome of the war, would depend largely upon our conduct in air battles. Every man who attended these special meetings could not help but be impressed by the Admiral's sincerity, nor could our staff officers ignore the consequences of failure so dramatically brought to their attention. At 0600 hours on the morning of April 18th, Admiral Yamamoto left Rabaul on a flight to Balale in southern Bougainville to inspect personally our airbase, which lay so close to enemy forces. Almost simultaneously with Yamamoto's departure, I flew from Rabaul with Admiral Kakuda for our return flight to Truk. When we returned to his flagship, the aircraft carrier Hiyo, his staff communications officer, ashen-faced, personally delivered a confidential telegram to Admiral Kakuda. Kakuda was a veteran combat naval air officer, known for his iron self-discipline under any circumstances. I was astonished to see the Admiral's face grow pale as he read the message. He uttered something unintelligible, and for some time afterward could not or would not speak to anyone. The incidents leading up to the attack by American fighter planes against Admiral Yamamoto's plane, and the death of Japan's greatest naval leader, are recorded in detail in the diary of Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, who was with the Admiral at the time of his death. The following passages in quotation marks are from Ugaki's diary. Admiral Yamamoto wished to fly from Rabaul to Buin via Balale to inspect frontline Navy forces and to pay a personal call on General Hyakutake, commander of the 17th Army. The Admiral planned to return on the 19th to our base at Truk. The flight was planned with Admiral Yamamoto's usual meticulous care. Personally aware of even the smallest difficulties of the Navy and Army forces in the Solomons, particularly those troops under General Hyakutake, which had been hard-pressed by savagely fighting enemy troops and ever-increasing air attacks, Yamamoto hoped by this frontline visit to better his own understanding of future problems. Aware that enemy intelligence would literally go to any lengths to discover his presence in the area, the Admiral discarded his white uniform and for the first time donned the Navy khaki garb. At 0600 hours, Admiral Yamamoto left the Rabaul airfield in the lead aircraft, a Type 1 Betty bomber, which carried, in addition to Yamamoto, Commander Ishizaki, his secretary, Surgeon Rear Admiral Takata, and Commander Toibana, his air staff officer. In the second aircraft with me were Paymaster Rear Admiral Kitamura, Commander Imanaka of the Communications Staff, Commander Muroi, Air Staff Officer, and Lieutenant Uno, our Meteorology Officer. As soon as I entered the second bomber, both aircraft began their take-off runs down the field. The lead bomber took to the air first. As our planes passed above the volcano at the bay's end, we slid into formation and took a southeast course. Clouds were intermittent, and with excellent visibility, flying conditions were good. I could see our escort fighters weaving in their protective pattern. 3 fighters flew off to our far left, 3 remained high above and behind us, and 3 others, making 9 in all, cruised to the right. Our bombers flew a tight formation, their wings almost touching, and my plane remained slightly behind and to the left of the lead ship. We flew at approximately 5,000 feet. We could clearly see the Admiral in the pilot's seat of the other bomber, and the passengers moving within the airplane. We reached the west side of Bougainville Island, flying at 2,200 feet directly over the jungle. A crew member handed me a note reading, "Our time of arrival at Balal is 0745 hours." I remember looking at my wristwatch and noting that the time was exactly 0730. In 15 minutes, we would arrive at our first stop. Without warning, the motors roared and the bomber plunged toward the jungle, close behind the lead airplane, leveling off at less than 200 feet. Nobody knew what had happened, and we scanned the sky anxiously for the enemy fighter planes we felt certain were diving to the attack. The crew chief, a flight warrant officer, answered our queries from his position in the narrow aisle. "It looks as if we made a mistake, sir. We shouldn't have dived." He certainly was right, for our pilots should never have left our original altitude. Our fighter planes had sighted a group of at least 24 enemy planes approaching from the south. They began to dive toward the bombers to warn them of the approaching enemy planes. Simultaneously, however, our bomber pilots also sighted the enemy force and, without orders, raced for low altitude. Not until we had leveled off did our crewmen take their battle positions. Screaming wind and noise assailed our ears as the men unlimbered the machine guns. Even as we pulled out of the dive and returned to horizontal flight above the jungle, our escort fighters turned into the attacking enemy planes, now identifiable as the big Lockheed P-38Cs. The numerically superior enemy force broke through the Zeros and plunged after our two bombers. My own plane swung sharply into a 90-degree turn. I watched the crew chief lean forward and tap the pilot on the shoulder, warning him that the enemy fighters were fast closing in. Our plane separated from the lead bomber. For a few moments I lost sight of Yamamoto's plane and finally located Betty far to the right. I was horrified to see the airplane flying slowly just above the jungle, headed to the south, with bright orange flames rapidly enveloping the wings and fuselage. About 4 miles away from us, the bomber trailed thick black smoke, dropping lower and lower. Sudden fear for the Admiral's life gripped me. I tried to call Commander Mulroy, standing immediately behind me, but could not speak. I grasped him by the shoulder and pulled him to the window, pointing to the Admiral's burning plane. I caught a last glimpse of myself, an eternal farewell to this beloved officer, before our plane again swung sharply over in a steep turn. Tracers flashed by our wings, and the pilot desperately maneuvered to evade the pursuing fighter plane. I waited impatiently for the airplane to return to horizontal position so that I could observe the Admiral's bomber. Although I hoped for the best, I knew only too well what the fate of the airplane would be. As our own plane snapped out of its turn, I scanned the jungle. Yamamoto's plane was no longer in sight. Black smoke boiled from the dense jungle into the air. Even as I stared at the funeral pyre of the crashed bomber, our own plane straightened out from its frantic maneuvering and at full speed raced toward Moyler Point. Shortly we were over the open sea. We noticed the concentration of dogfighting planes in the area where Admiral Yamamoto's bomber had plunged into the jungle. Other fighters were separating from the group and turning after us now. I stared helplessly as a silver H-shaped P-38 half-rolled in a screaming zoom, then turned steeply and closed rapidly toward our plane. Our gunners were firing desperately at the big enemy fighter, but to little avail. The bomber's 7.7mm machine guns could not reach the approaching P-38. Taking advantage of his superior speed, the enemy pilot closed in rapidly and, still beyond the range of our defensive machine guns, opened fire. I watched the P-38's nose seem to burst into a twinkling flame, and suddenly the bomber shook from the impact of the enemy's machine gun bullets and cannon shells. The P-38 pilot was an excellent gunner, for first his fusillade of bullets and shells crashed into the right side of the airplane, then into the left. The drumming sounds vibrated through the airplane, which rocked from the impact of the enemy fire. We knew we were now completely helpless and waited for our end to come. The P-38 hung grimly to our tail, pouring in his deadly fire. One by one, our answering machine guns fell silent. Abruptly, the crew chief, who had been shouting orders to his men, fell from our view. Several of the crew were already dead as the bullets screamed through the airplane. Commander Mulroy sprawled over the chair and table in the fuselage compartment, his hands thrown out before him, his head rolling lifelessly back and forth as the plane shuddered. Another cannon shell suddenly tore open the right wing. The chief pilot, directly in front of me, pushed the control column forward. Our only chance of survival was to make a crash landing in the sea. I did not realize it at the time, but a Zero pilot above us in a futile attack against the grimly pursuing P-38 reported heavy smoke pouring from our bomber. Almost into the water, the pilot pulled back on the controls to bring the airplane out of its dive, but he could no longer control the aircraft. Enemy bullets had shattered the cables. Desperately, the pilot killed our power, but again it was too late. At full speed, the bomber smashed into the water. The left wing crumpled and Betty rolled sharply over to the left. Prepared for an emergency landing, I do not recall being injured in the crash. Apparently, the shock of the planes meeting the water at such high speed numbed my senses, for when I was hurled into the aisle from my seat, my body was bruised and cut. The impact of the crash momentarily stunned me, and everything turned black. I felt the crushing force of salt water pouring into the fuselage, and almost immediately we were below the surface. I was completely helpless. Convinced this was my end, I said a requiem to myself. Naturally, it was difficult to coherently remember everything which happened in those incredible moments, but I vaguely recall that I felt as if life had come to its end. I could not bring myself to move, and could only lie perfectly still. I do not believe I was actually knocked unconscious. I did not swallow any seawater. Everything was hazy, and I could not tell how much time passed before. The following day, search planes discovered the wreckage of the lead bomber in which Admiral Yamamoto had flown to his death. The reconnaissance pilots found no sign of life and reported that fire had entirely consumed the wreckage. On the day of the attack, a native reported to an Army road construction crew that a Japanese plane had crashed in the jungle along Bougainville's west coast. Army headquarters dispatched a rescue force, which reached the wreckage on April 19th. They picked up the corpses and began their return. It was this same group that our Navy rescue force encountered. The Army group had found Admiral Yamamoto's body, still in his pilot's seat, hurled clear of the airplane. A sword was held tightly in his hand. His body had not yet decomposed, and even in death, dignity did not leave the great naval officer. To us, Isoroku Yamamoto virtually was a god. Our doctors later examined his body aboard a submarine chaser, and found bullet holes through the lower part of the skull, as well as in the shoulder. Presumably the Admiral died instantly aboard the airplane. In addition, only the chief medical officer, his body partially burned, could be identified, as the remainder of the group were burned beyond recognition. As to the wreckage of my own airplane, divers went to 67 feet below the water's surface, but found only the wheels, engines, propellers, machine guns, and one officer's sword. The following day, April 20th, the bodies of 2 crewmen were washed up on the shore. Of all the personnel aboard both bombers, only Rear Admiral Kitamura, the pilot of my bomber, and I survived. More than 20 men and officers perished. Although death is an everyday occurrence in war, I feel that I am to be blamed for this incident. I was informed at a later date that the enemy, which had in the past made only single-plane reconnaissance missions, had, only 1 or 2 days before April 18th, increased his reconnaissance to fighter plane groups. This information from our field forces did not reach Vice Admiral Kusaka's headquarters until 24 hours after the incident. Had we been informed immediately of the sudden appearance of the enemy fighter formations, we could have averted the terrible loss of Admiral Yamamoto. But we were too late. In the same area where so many of his own men had shed their blood for Japan, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto came to the end of his brilliant career. Not only did we suffer an irreplaceable loss in his death, but Japan also lost Commanders Toibana and Muroi, considered the 2 brains of the Navy's air staff. The injured admirals Ugaki and Kitamura and their pilot were rescued by our ships, which sped to the scene of the water crash. The itinerary of Admiral Yamamoto and his staff was, of course, a closely guarded secret. Behind the chain of events leading to the successful enemy attack, however, lay the direct cause for the incident. Partially as a courtesy message, the commander of the Shortland seaplane base southwest of Buin had notified his forces in naval code that the admiral would personally inspect their area. This same message was intercepted and decoded by American Navy headquarters at Pearl Harbor. The Navy immediately informed Army Air Forces headquarters at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Late in the afternoon of April 17th, the Henderson Field Message Center delivered to Major John W. Mitchell, P-38 commander at Guadalcanal, a cablegram from Frank Knox, Secretary of the Navy, with the complete information on Admiral Yamamoto's scheduled inspection tour. The message also noted that Yamamoto was most punctilious and could be counted upon to follow his schedule rigidly. Included in the message was a list of the other officers accompanying the Admiral, as well as the fact that the staff would fly in 2 new type Mitsubishi bombers escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The only planes capable of performing the interception mission were the Henderson Field P-38S, which had the speed, range, and destructive firepower for the attack. The big fighters would have to fly at least 435 miles from Guadalcanal before they could intercept west of Kahili. Contrary to Vice Admiral Ugaki's report of at least 24 enemy planes, Mitchell had available only 18 P-38 fighters. He planned to use 6 fighters as the attack force against the bombers, which he estimated would fly below 10,000 feet, while the remaining 12 airplanes at 20,000 feet would try to draw off the Zero escort. Interception was planned when Yamamoto's plane was only 35 miles from its destination. 2 planes aborted the mission at the start. Mitchell then assigned 4 of his 16 P-38S to make the attack against the bombers. Lieutenant Thomas G. Lanphier was the pilot who shot down Yamamoto's plane and also shot down a defending Zero fighter in his attack. Lanphier reported that he put a long burst into the right engine, then the right wing, and, still beyond the range of the bomber's defending tail cannon, watched the wing break into flame and tear off the airplane. Caught by 2 pursuing Zeros, Lanphier went into a steep climb and lost the Zeros. Lieutenant Rex Barber, attacking with Lanphier, raced through 3 intercepting Zero fighters and shot down the second bomber. Lieutenant Besby F. Holmes shot down 2 Zeros, making our losses for the day 3 fighters and 2 bombers. Our pilots shot down Lieutenant Ray Hines' P-38, and, we verified later, most of the 15 P-38S which returned to Guadalcanal were badly shot up. Some time later, when I, Okumiya, was at Buin during a new attack against the enemy, I visited Admiral Yamamoto's tomb. This was a small, inscribed stone placed over the site where the body was cremated, near the Buin headquarters. Full credit must be given to the fine activities of the American intelligence services, which broke the Japanese code and kept secret the fact that the Americans were fully acquainted with our naval activities. It was this advanced knowledge which did so much to defeat our fleet at Midway and which destroyed the Admiral's plane. These unheroic and behind-the-scenes moves not only frustrated the Midway operation and took the life of our most able officer, but contributed directly to our eventual defeat. Ironically, Admiral Yamamoto prophesied his own fate immediately after the Midway conflict. Similarly, our position in the war degenerated specifically as the Admiral had predicted even before December 8, 1941. To me, who had in the past served with this great man, my return to Truk, when we were informed of his death, was a particularly sorrowing moment. From the bridge of the aircraft carrier Hiyo, with grief-stricken Vice Admiral Kakuda, I watched Admiral Yamamoto's flag being lowered from the mast of the world's greatest battleship, the Yamato. I thought to myself at the time, those who so strongly insisted upon war with the United States and England may still be dreaming of success, although victory slips further and further from our grasp. Perhaps, however, we who are carrying the fight to the enemy, as we are ordered to do, may still survive this conflict. It is impossible for me or any other man to express in words the mixed emotions which must have been experienced by the Admiral who so long ago realized the dark future of our country, should we be forced by those in power to launch this war. Despite his apprehensions, as the Commander-in-Chief, Yamamoto was obliged to serve his country to the best of his ability. This he did, but with his command went the feeling of guilt that he had failed in his efforts to convince his government and its ruling hierarchy that war could bring only disaster. Whatever history will decide, the Admiral now can rest peacefully in his grave. At least his death came in a plane of the Naval Air Force, for which he was directly responsible. His unflagging efforts had given his country the most powerful naval air arm in the world. And who can forget the personality of this man, typified by his first action in 1924 as the executive officer of the Kasumigara Air Corps, when he embarrassed the entire corps by insisting that he fly with the poorest pilot of all. The only decisive victory achieved by the Japanese Navy after the disastrous Battle of Midway was scored in the engagement of air-sea forces off Santa Cruz, east of the Guadalcanal area. After Midway and the fleet reorganization, our surface forces operated with the aircraft carrier as a nucleus. Admiral Yamamoto divided our major naval strength into 2 units, each with 3 aircraft carriers. These were the vanguard force of Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, commander of the Second Fleet, with 3 carriers, 2 battleships, 5 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 12 destroyers, and the Carrier Task Force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the Third Fleet, with 3 carriers, 2 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 16 destroyers. Both fleet units operated in the seas east of the Solomon Islands. Kondo's force coordinated its activities with army groups on Guadalcanal Island, while Nagumo's ships patrolled east of Kondo's fleet to ward off possible enemy carrier attacks. By October 23, 1942, intelligence reported an ominous build-up of enemy carrier strength. Meanwhile, we had suffered our own losses, including the sinking of the aircraft carrier Ryuho, which went to the bottom on August 23 in the Second Solomon Sea Battle, and the aircraft carrier Hiyo, which limped home with battered engines. Hondo's force was left with only a single carrier, the Junyo, under Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuda, commander of the 2nd Carrier Division. I, Okumiya, was their air staff officer to Kakuda. After October 16th, we could find no trace of the enemy carriers in the area. They had apparently disappeared. A week later, we encountered a sudden increase in enemy reconnaissance plane activities. The 2 facts appeared to be linked together. The Americans often withdrew their combat fleet units from an operational theatre, taking advantage of the tremendous range of their land-based reconnaissance planes, which kept the warships fully advised of our activities. We sought vainly for some indication of the whereabouts of the enemy ships. On October 24th, we picked up an American radio broadcast, which stated that a major sea and air battle is expected in the near future in the Solomon Islands area. Something was in the wind. October 27th was Navy Day for the enemy, and perhaps the Carrier Task Force commanders would choose this day for a surprise assault. I was familiar with the American love of adventure on such dates, and expected the worst to happen. Our military forces were even then committed to the second all-out attack, designed to throw the enemy troops off Guadalcanal, and the Americans might take advantage of the situation to force a decisive sea battle at a time when our land forces desperately needed all our support. On the morning of October 25th, enemy flying boats surveyed the Nagumo force, which, despite strong fighter patrols, could do little to keep the long-range planes from making detailed observations of our fleet strength and manoeuvres. Apparently, a major enemy effort could be expected. Vice Admiral Kondo turned his ships to the south, and by late October 25th prepared his planes for airstrikes against enemy forces on Guadalcanal. 100 nautical miles to the east of Kondo, Nagumo's force also worked its way southward as a buffer against the anticipated enemy carrier attacks. Nagumo had learned a bitter lesson at Midway, and he used the tactics which that defeat revealed to him. 60 to 80 nautical miles ahead of his flagship, Shokaku, steamed the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, the heavy cruiser Chikuma, and 7 destroyers. The heavy cruiser Tone and the destroyer Teruzuki cut the Pacific waters 200 nautical miles east of the Shokaku to protect his flank. Approximately at 0050 hours on October 26th, a large aircraft, presumably a flying boat, appeared over the carriers of the Nagumo force and dropped a salvo of bombs which exploded alongside the Zuikaku, the fleet's second-largest carrier. The bombs missed the vessel so narrowly that the entire bridge became enveloped in the smoke of the detonation. Fortunately, there were no casualties. Captain Toshitane Takata, senior staff officer of the Nagumo force, then on the Shokaku's bridge, reported the attack to Admiral Nagumo and Chief of Staff Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka. Nagumo felt he was being drawn into a trap and dispatched to the fleet the following orders. Emergency turn together 180 degrees to starboard. This was followed by all ships execute turn speed 24 knots. The assembled ships of the Nagumo force, shrouded in the darkness of the early morning, executed the sudden reversal of course. Where the fleet had attempted to approach the enemy under cover of night and attack in full strength under the shroud of darkness, it was now in a hasty retreat to the north. The turn was ordered approximately 250 nautical miles northeast of the Guadalcanal airfield. In the early morning of October 26th, I was the staff officer on duty at the Yunyos Bridge, and was the first officer to learn of the bombing and Nagumo's sudden withdrawal. I transmitted the information at once to Rear Admiral Kakuda and the Chief of Staff Captain Mineo Yamaoka. Shortly afterward, Admiral Kondo's flagship, the heavy cruiser Atago, dispatched new fleet orders. The entire Kondo force turned and headed northward at high speed, following the action of the Nagumo force. It was exactly 0200 hours when the ships turned. For the last 10 days, we had been without any information as to the movements of the enemy aircraft carriers. We had little knowledge of any American fleet movements, beyond a single report that 2 battleships and 4 cruisers had been sighted approximately 300 nautical miles south of Guadalcanal. The attack earlier during the night, however, indicated strongly that American carriers were within striking range of their planes. Admiral Nagumo launched 16 reconnaissance seaplanes and 8 Type 97 Kate bombers from the advance and main fleet units to search to the east and south of our ships. The planes took off before dawn. As Takata had forecast, enemy carriers were found in the immediate area. A Shokaku reconnaissance plane searching southeast of the carrier reported at 0450 hours. Have sighted 1 enemy aircraft carrier and 15 other vessels. Enemy fleet is bearing to the northwest. The long-sought carrier, or carriers, was 250 nautical miles southeast of the Shokaku, or 140 nautical miles 15 degrees from New Denny Island. The other reconnaissance planes in the area flew to the reported area and continued to track the progress of the enemy ships. The 3 carriers of the 1st Carrier Division had been in readiness for the fighting. The planes were hastily fueled and rushed to the decks for takeoff locations. Admiral Nagumo ordered immediate airstrikes. At 5:15 a.m., the first attack force left the Shokaku. 45 minutes later, the second group thundered off the ship. Nagumo ordered the latter formations launched ahead of their scheduled departure. Even as the first unit prepared for takeoff, the Shokaku's radar picked up what appeared to be enemy planes approaching our force. Since the Zuikaku lacked radar, the great carrier depended upon the radar reports from the Shokaku. Aboard the former carrier, the armourers worked feverishly to load torpedoes. The first attack group, under Lieutenant Commander Mamoru Seki of the Shokaku, consisted of 22 Val dive bombers. Lieutenant Jiichiro Imajuku took off from the Zuikaku with 18 Kate torpedo bombers. Protecting the slow and vulnerable torpedo planes were 27 Zero fighters led by Lieutenant Commander Hideki Shingo of the Shokaku. The second attack group was made up of 12 Kates under Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata of the Shokaku and 20 Vals under Lieutenant Sadamu Takahashi of the Zuikaku. The same ship provided a fighter escort of 16 Zeros led by Lieutenant Kenjiro Notomi.